Welcome back, His 240 students. Okay, so when we picture Kentucky in the 1920s, it's super tempting to just imagine this sudden, dramatic leap straight out of the Victorian era and right into the Roaring Twenties. Flappers, jazz, the whole shebang. But history is rarely that neat and tidy. Today's explainer looks at this decade not as some overnight transformation, but as a fierce, ongoing tug of war. We're talking about a massive dialectical struggle between sweeping, totally unavoidable modernization on one hand and deeply entrenched traditionalism on the other. People weren't just passively floating through time, they were actively confronting change, constantly having to decide what to keep from their past and what they were willing to accept about their future. So let's dive into it. To really get the vibe of this era, we have to wrap our heads around the immense post-World War I anxiety that was just hanging in the air. The world had just barely survived a brutal global war and a devastating influenza epidemic. Just consider the words of the legendary retired Courier Journal editor Henry Watterson back in 1920. He's looking around, seeing the rise of Bolshevism abroad, women's suffrage, prohibition at home, and his conclusion? Total societal collapse, a literal dark age interlude. For the older generation, all this rapid change didn't look like progress. It felt like the absolute end of civilization. They were staring down a modern America they didn't quite recognize, and frankly, they weren't sure they even wanted it. So we end up with this stark ideological battlefield. On one side, you've got the forces of modernism, youthful flappers bucking those traditional gender roles, the sudden explosion of mass media and national sports, and university science classes actually starting to teach Darwinian evolution. But then, on the flip side, you have this fierce, deeply rooted reactionary backlash. Fundamentalist leaders launched these incredibly aggressive campaigns to completely purge evolution from public schools. They nearly passed a statewide ban in 1922. This was a full-on culture war long before we ever started using that term in modern politics. Now, part of that reactionary wave included the rise of the Second Ku Klux Klan, which targeted African Americans, for sure, but also went after immigrants, Catholics, and Jews. But here's the fascinating thing. The Klan really struggled to establish the deep political roots in Kentucky that it found in neighboring states like Indiana. And if we look at the demographic realities of the state, it explains exactly why. Immigrants made up less than 2% of the population. Catholics and Jews combined were only about 8%. So while the Klan's message of xenophobia and religious bigotry definitely drew some massive crowds, mathematically speaking, they simply lacked the critical mass of demographic targets to sustain any long-term statewide political dominance. Plus, it helped that powerful local leaders boldly spoke out against them. Of course, this friction between old prejudices and new authority didn't just stay in the political arena. It bled directly into the streets. Take the Will Lockett riot of 1920 in Lexington. An African-American man was on trial, and a mob of thousands literally tried to storm the courthouse to dole out lynch law. But here's a massive historical pivot. Governor Edwin Morrow deployed the National Guard, and they actually opened fire on the white mob, killing 6 people. Now, Lockett was still executed after what was essentially a sham trial, but this violent clash represented a defining transition in Kentucky. The state was aggressively flexing its muscles, signaling that the era of local mob lynch law was officially being replaced by the supreme rule of the state. However, and we really need to emphasize this, the establishment of state order absolutely did not equal racial progress. In fact, the 1920s saw a deepening, systematic segregation creeping all across Kentucky. We're talking parks, horse racing, public libraries. In some rural areas, armed white mobs, known as night riders, were violently expelling entire black communities, openly boasting about turning their towns all white. It's incredibly dark. Yet, right in the middle of this grim reality, there were critical pockets of resistance. For example, the newly formed Louisville NAACP branch secured a landmark U.S. Supreme Court victory in Buchanan v. Worley, which actually struck down residential segregation ordinances. So it was just a decade of intense, often really painful contradictions. Okay, so with all this cultural and social chaos swirling around, how is it actually managed politically? Well, the short answer is it wasn't managed by strict political parties. It was managed by money. Politics in the 1920s was run by what reformers bitterly called the bipartisan combine. Formal party lines? They meant pretty much nothing. The real power lay in the hands of wealthy millionaire bosses, guys like Robert Worth Bingham and James B. Brown up in Louisville, alongside these quiet, behind-the-scenes power brokers. They operated through really formal, constantly shifting alliances, essentially using vast mountains of cash to protect specific interests, whether they were guarding the racing industry or the coal fields. And eventually, these backroom political battles played right out onto Kentucky's physical landscape. By 1929, Cumberland Falls became ground zero for this epic fight between industrial modernization and natural preservation.
You had a powerful hydroelectric company, fully backed by Governor Flem D. Sampson, wanting to dam the falls to generate power and bring in jobs. Totally understandable, right? But on the flip side, conservationists, backed by a wealthy out-of-state millionaire who offered to buy the land and just give it to the state as a park, fought tooth and nail to protect its natural beauty.
Which brings us to a really vital question, one you should definitely consider for your own historical thinking. Does progress always mean development? Well, in the case of Cumberland Falls, the Kentucky legislature ultimately decided that no, it didn't. In a super rare move, they overrode the governor's veto, accepted the donated land, and made it a state park. The falls remained undammed. It was just this profound moment where Kentuckians collectively put their foot down and decided that modern industrial progress shouldn't come at the absolute expense of their natural heritage. So by the time we reach the end of the decade, a really clear historical synthesis emerges from all this friction. Kentucky navigated the Roaring Twenties by carving out a path of conservative moderation. They flat out rejected the radical extremes of pure modernism, but they also rejected the complete reactionary shutdown pushed by fundamentalists in the KKK. They didn't embrace every single change happening around them, but they accepted the times. They tried to keep the very best of their past while reconciling their traditions with inevitable change, carefully avoiding blind, stubborn resistance.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to chew on. As the 1920s closed, the world was teetering right on the brink of the Great Depression. So how did this established baseline of conservative moderation, this very specific habit of walking the middle path, prepare Kentucky for the massive systemic shocks and the sweeping federal interventions of the New Deal era that were just around the corner? Think about how a society that is well practiced in absorbing and modifying change, rather than outright rejecting it, adapts to total economic collapse. Keep that front of mind as we wrap up this explainer and transition into our next era of study.